Okay, so thank you all for attending. I very much appreciate it, especially today. As I said earlier, I had no idea this was a holiday when I originally scheduled it. But trust me, everyone will get a link for a downloadable recording probably tomorrow. So again, thank you. This is all about retention policies and Microsoft Purview and why I think they're not a good idea. So, first of all, a housekeeping note. Please note that the materials in this webinar are not to be distributed outside your organization. Okay, so this is part of EDRMS, Electronic Document Records Management Systems or Solutions. There are three components to any EDRMS. There's a retention schedule, record-keeping software, in this case, Purview, and SharePoint. So the assumption underlying this session is that the goal is to manage records in SharePoint, okay? Now, keep in mind that those three products don't know the other exists. Essentially, they're three islands. So building an EDRMS project is tricky. You have to make all three work together. So let's first talk about the relationship between SharePoint and Purview. SharePoint does not manage records, and it never will. Well, I want to repeat that. SharePoint does not manage records and never will. The whole idea of Purview is to allow you to apply records control to the content inside SharePoint. So Purview is a bit of a foreign object to SharePoint. Users of SharePoint don't see Purview. They don't interact with it. They don't touch it. Purview is really not meant for end users to even see. There's no reason for them to see it. So to a SharePoint user, they never come in contact with Purview whatsoever, okay? But you, the records manager, you have to make Purview control the content of SharePoint. And what that does is it radically, and I mean radically, alters how SharePoint gets deployed. But that's another topic for another day. So first of all, what does compliance really mean? Well, to me, it means two things. Number one is that every document in SharePoint adheres or complies with the official retention schedule. So if there's a document in there about an expense reimbursement, the rule might be 202-2, which means retain for 5 years and destroy. If it's about, let's say, fleet vehicle maintenance, then it might have the rule applied to it, which might say keep until end of life of vehicle, then 5 years, then destroy. So everything gets classified against the retention schedule. Number two is that the document itself has to be managed as a record. And what does that mean? That means that it has to be immutable. No one can edit the document, delete the document, or edit or delete any of its associated metadata. That's absolutely not negotiable because that's what it takes to preserve the integrity of the record as evidence. So we have to manage it as a record. That means that it's immutable, it's classified against the retention schedule, and let's not forget that 60% of all your records, yes, I'm talking to you, all 60% of all your records are what we call case records, which means that they have to be triggered by an event date. So let's take a look at a cold, hard reality here. If I take one document and I give it to 10 users at random in your organization, and I ask them two questions. One, is this a record or not? And two, where does this belong in the retention schedule? You know what's going to happen? I'm going to get 10 different answers. I've done this, and it really is true. A lot of people haven't seen your retention schedule since they've been working there, right? And if I do that exercise again with the same document and the same 10 people a week later, guess what happens then? I get another half a dozen different answers. What's the conclusion here? Well, the conclusion is that we really can't rely on end users to do this. Now, school of thought. There are two schools of thought for compliance. One says this: compliance comes from end users. It's their duty. They have an obligation to manage their documents as records. It's written right into our corporate policy. So get to it. Manage your documents as records. That's one school of thought. The second school of thought is the opposite, which says, hold on a minute. Compliance doesn't come from end users. compliance comes from our organization and it's imposed on end users. If the end user thinks this document should be kept for 5 years, they are wrong. The official rule in the retention schedule says 10. They don't like it, too bad, okay? So that's a totally different viewpoint. Of those two, one works, one doesn't. The one that works is where we impose it. The one that doesn't is where we leave it up to the users. Can you imagine having 1,000 users and each user decides what the retention is going to be depending on the day of the week, their mood, whether their dog ate their homework that night? No, it doesn't work. It has never worked. I've never seen it work. So I believe that the only way to have a successful EDRMS is to impose the compliance upon the users, okay? Now, with Purview, out of the box at least, if you just do what it asks you to do, it goes into the right-hand mode here. It goes into compliance, comes from end users. And that's the philosophy. That's a design philosophy of Purview. My personal philosophy is compliance does not come from users. It's imposed on them. So right away, out of the box, if you do what Purview wants you to do, you're going to be upside down, in my view. Okay? We have to flip that upside down. Fortunately, it's possible to do it. Now, Purview is tricky. It's difficult to learn, but it does records. It absolutely does it. Its philosophy is that compliance comes from users, and we have to flip that around. And when Microsoft says this is records management, what they really mean is records management in our perspective, our way, not what you're used to. Totally different. And compliance to Microsoft is very, very large. It has a huge scope. The way I put it is this, is if you look at Purview as a whole, imagine it's a bowling ball. Inside that bowling ball is a golf ball. The bowling ball is hollow, so there's a golf ball rattling around inside it. That golf ball is the records management portion of Purview, okay? So this session and all my writings and videos and recordings and knowledge are all about the golf ball, not the bowling ball, not the larger Purview, okay? So that's part of the reason why Microsoft does records their way, because they see it as a bigger context. In order to know Purview, you have to learn a completely new language. It is extremely technical. It's not like an ordinary piece of software. You install it, you learn it, you apply it. It doesn't work like that at all, okay? You have to really go deep in Purview, learn it, understand it, work it, and be very technical about it. So this is the location within the bowling ball, the Microsoft Purview. This is their main menu. And this is the records management submenu right here, okay? We're not going to be actually touching the real software. I'm just going to tell you, showing you about the software. So let's get into it. Now, retention in Purview has two meanings. One is a retention label, and two is a retention policy. They're vastly different, to say the least. A retention label is a retention rule, okay? A retention policy is a retention rule. You got it? They're both doing the same thing, but radically differently. So a retention label is a rule. And what does a rule look like? Think of a rule as three parts: a trigger, a period of time, and an action. The trigger is usually the document's age, but it could be an event trigger. Retention period is how long to keep it. And then the disposition action is what to do with it at the end of its life, okay? So every retention rule has three parts. Both of these are retention rules, but the second one, retention policy, is a single rule for all documents. It does not manage the documents as records, okay? A retention label is one rule for one item, and it does manage it as a record. So there's a compliance danger of retention policies. Now, by the time the session is over, I'm hoping to convince you not to use retention policies, and I intend to give you 5 reasons why not. So now let's talk about policies for a minute. Turns out there are 2 types of policies in Purview: a retention policy and a label policy. totally different. A retention policy is a rule. One rule for all items in a given location. What is a location? A location is either a product, such as SharePoint, or a location within the product, such as a site, a library, or a folder. Okay, so one rule for all items underneath that location. So it can be an entire SharePoint. It can be an entire site in SharePoint. It can be an entire label, library. It can be an entire folder. But what you got to know is that the rule inherits down to everything underneath that location. Okay? So it can be a mile wide. A label policy is a container of retention labels. Okay? So think of it like a plastic shopping bag, a bag of labels. Okay? And the label policy, its purpose is to push retention labels to different workloads. Workload is the alternative name to a location or product. The three are used ambiguously throughout Purview. I can never figure it out, but I use the word product or a location within a product. Okay, so as you learn Purview, you'll notice that the language changes all over the place. You'll read a label policy, you'll read retention policy, then you'll be reading retention label policy, and too often you'll read policy. What are we talking about? So there's a lot of confusion out there when it comes to that. So let's dig just a little deeper into a retention policy versus a retention label. So a policy is a rule, a label is a rule, but the policy is applied to a place, not a thing. A label is applied to a thing, not a place. Okay? What is a thing? It's a document. It's an item. The proper definition of an item depends on the product. Now remember, Purview is meant to apply record keeping to all of Microsoft's products, 10 of them. I'm only concerned with 3. SharePoint, Exchange, and OneDrive. But for today, I'm only going to focus on SharePoint. So an item is a document in SharePoint or OneDrive. It's a message in Exchange or a folder in OneDrive. So you got to remember that a policy is a rule and a label is a rule, but completely different applications. Now, what places can you apply a policy to? Well, the places are sites or locations within the sites, such as libraries or folders. And in Exchange, it's mailboxes. Now, you can apply policies to Exchange, and that's not a bad idea. But I'm not here today to talk about Exchange. I have an even better idea for that. But for now, I'm only referring to SharePoint, where I think it's a very bad idea. Okay, again, we're going to keep going a little deeper every pass here. So a retention policy has no lockdown. Lockdown is our street language for immutable. And remember, in order to manage something as a record, it has to be immutable, along with its metadata, okay? Can Purview allow you to unlock a locked record? Yes. Should you do it? Absolutely not. Never allow that. That's just crazy. And also, with a retention policy, we cannot handle 60% of our records. Why not? Because 60% or more of your records are case records, which means you need to have event-based triggers. There are no event triggers for retention policies. None. So you are not managing anything as a record when you use a retention policy. Now, let's talk about a label. This is records management. The label is like a sticky note. Okay? You stick it on the item or the document anywhere within SharePoint. It doesn't matter where the document is, you can stick it on there. And again, the label has 3 parts. It's a retention rule with 3 parts: a trigger, a period of time, and a disposition action, right? So once you stick the label on an item, it's stuck there for life. You only lose that label if you send it outside the M365 environment. If you email it to someone in Switzerland, they receive it, there's no label on it. Obviously not, right? And we have three types of triggers. The time it was applied, the event, or the item's age. Okay? We need two of these three. So we have what we need. You can also use 1, 2, 3, 4 different other methods. There's 4 or 5 methods you can use to apply a label. My belief is that only one of them is correct and appropriate. But again, that's another session, not today. And you cannot apply labels to everything. You can apply them to everything in SharePoint, though, and that's why we're here today, talk about SharePoint. Now, what can you apply a retention policy to? Well, remember, I'm trying to convince you never to use a retention policy, but you can apply them to quite a bit, okay? Just remember this about a retention policy. It goes to a place, and everything underneath that place hierarchically has that retention rule, that one single retention rule, okay? This is not records management. This is what I call cleanup. There are use cases for this, no question about it, but not for records, not for record keeping. Now let's talk about the triggers of a retention policy. You only get two, either the date created or the date last modified, okay? Now, in the records world, we have to calculate the document's age. How does the software do that? It takes today's date, subtracts the date of the document from it. So if the document is a PDF and the front cover says January 1st, 2010, then we both know that's a 16-year-old document, right? That's just a fact of life. You can't change the age of anything. But if we take that 16-year-old document and stick it in SharePoint, it's 1 minute old because Purview calculates it from the create date. So therefore, it takes today's date, subtracts the create date, comes up with basically 0. So the age calculations are inherently wrong in Purview. That's okay though, because in my estimation, 90% of the time that doesn't matter because it will throw off the retention calculation by less than a year. And if you're less than a year, you're safe in most cases. The only time you're not safe is when you're dealing with older records. Last modified date, well, I don't really have a use case for that as a trigger. But so those are the only two triggers though, okay? The big story on triggers is what you don't have. What you don't have is event triggers. That means you cannot use the retention policy for 60% plus of all your records. In other words, we're kind of out of business here, right? Now, another thing to know about retention policies is this. Let's say you have 2 sites, Site A and Site B in SharePoint, and you have 100 libraries, let's say 500 libraries in each, and you have many document sets within each. That's fine. That's normal, right? And you have a retention policy in Site A that says keep for 5 years and destroy. You have a retention policy on Site B that says keep for 10 years and destroy. Well, if you move a document from Site A to Site B, it loses the retention rule because it doesn't have it attached to the document, right? It just gains the retention rule of whatever is inherited down from the retention policy on Site B. So retention rules aren't associated with the document. So retention rule can change depending on the location of the document. That is not a good thing. If you're moving documents around, well, you lose compliance because compliance says this is the rule and that is it, right? This is just a simple screen capture, very rudimentary. It's very basic. You retain for X years, and then you start the retention period based on when the item was created, which is kind of a white lie, right? That's not the time it was created. SharePoint's create date is really the date it was loaded into SharePoint, okay? And then this is delete items automatically. Oh no, we do not ever want that because that is not records compliant. It doesn't adhere to the retention schedule. So the use case for retention policies is something other than records management. I call it cleanup. Now in blue here, this is Microsoft's educational slide on the difference between a retention policy and a retention label. And as you can see, all the behavior we're looking for comes from the label. We want it to be locked down, made immutable, right? We want it to stay that way. If you move it around, keep it that way. So uh, uh, we need the label, not the policy. We don't get anything from the policy. All we get is a rule, which is applied to hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of documents, no matter what their subject is. Now, this is where we start to get into trouble, big trouble. Um, if you have a site or a tenant, SharePoint site, and it has a retention rule, let's say keep 5 years and destroy. And it has hundreds of libraries, like any SharePoint site. One library might have a different retention rule, which could say keep 10 years and destroy. If I'm a document in that library, I now have two retention rules. I have one from the site at the top and one from the library. The one at the site says keep for 5 years. The one at the library, for whatever reason, says keep for 10 years. What's going on? Well, they're both valid at the same time. What does that mean? That means they're now competing with each other. And we haven't even talked about labels yet, right? So just with policies alone, you can end up with what I call a Venn diagram down below here. You might have not one, not two, but three retention rules coming from some inheritance in some SharePoint structure. What's the real retention rule? Well, you're going to have to figure that out. You're going to have to do a Venn diagram like analysis of all three competing rules and figure out what the net, what I call the effective retention rule is. So let's look at some examples. Now, first of all, how does Microsoft resolve this dilemma? Well, they enforced Purview enforces a set of 4 principles. I call them rules, but they're principles. And I'm going to show you how those principles work. This Purview itself will determine what the net retention rule is. You don't get to choose it. Here's how it works. If we have rule 1, which is a policy that says delete in 3 years, and rule 2, which is a label, then and the label says keep for 5 years, which one wins? Well, rule 2. Why? Because of this principle. A retention wins out over a deletion. Okay? Another scenario, we have a retention policy that says keep for 5 and a second policy which says keep for 10. Which one wins? R2, because it's the longest retention period. So the longest retention period wins. Scenario 3, I have not 1, not 2, but 3 competing retention rules. Rule 1 was assigned is a label that was assigned by a user. Purview calls that an explicit label. And it says delete in 7 years. Rule 2, however, is a retention policy that I'm inheriting from something above me. And it says delete in 5 years. And as if that wasn't bad enough, there's Rule 3, another retention policy that says delete in 10. All 3 are in effect. Which one wins? Rule 1, because what a user chooses takes precedence over anything that's in a policy. Okay? Where does that philosophy come from? Well, from Purview's design philosophy, which is compliance comes from users, not from the employer. I think that's backwards, upside down. Fourth and final example, we have Rule 1, which says delete in 3. It's a policy. Rule 2, also a policy, says delete in 5. Which one wins? Rule 1. Why? Because of this principle that the shortest of 2 deletions wins. Now, I don't know what's going through your mind right now, but when I look at this, one word comes to my mind. Crazy. How are you supposed to manage this? My personal belief, You don't. You can't. Too complicated. Imagine in 1,000 users, industry norm is 12 records per person per day. That's a flow rate of 12,000 records per day. And that means 3 million, roughly 3 million a year. And we're supposed to do these Venn diagrams in our heads? That's crazy. So let's look at an example here. Here we have Site 1 with a retention policy that says retain for 5 years. It's hierarchical, so it's applied to these two subsites, if you have any subsites, and to this library and all other libraries in Site 1. Okay? I'm right here. This is me. I'm this document right here. So now, innocently, I'm going to be kept for 5 years. Everything's good. So is this. Everything else will be kept for 5 years. Everything, no matter what subject you're about. If I'm about an expense claim reimbursement, I'm get kept for 5 years. If I'm about a fleet vehicle maintenance, I'm still being kept for 5 years, then I'm gone. Okay? No matter what I am, I'm gone. Now, along comes another retention policy applied only to subsite 1, not subsite 2. So it says delete in 10 years. It's a conflict. So now I'm here. I have two rules. One says keep for 5, one says keep for 10. How long am I going to be kept for? 5, according to the principles. Now, what happens next? Well, the records manager is going to come along and say, excuse me, but we need labels around here. And that's the official retention rule. Notice I'm showing it in green. And so the company, the employer, the records representing the employer in the official retention schedule applies a label to that document. Okay? And the label says 25 years. So now I have 3 rules, 5, a 10, and a 25. Which one wins? The one that was applied here. So thankfully, we're okay. We win this one, okay? But 6 months later, the user gets wind of this and says, 25 years, that's nuts. I don't like 25 years. I would prefer 2 years. So what does the user do? The user goes to that document and puts a label on it that says delete in 2 years. And guess what? That label pushes aside the official corporate label that came from the records manager. Pushes it aside. Why? Because of the philosophy, the design philosophy of Purview. Compliance comes from users, not from records managers, right? So therefore, I now have 1, 2, 3, 4 competing rules. Which one wins? Can you make a guess? It's delete in 2 years because of that design philosophy, right? Delete in 2. That's crazy. So when I said earlier in this session, I said one of the things, to the secrets of Purview is knowing what to avoid, what to do as a workaround, and what to not deploy. Do not let users do this because you're destroying your compliance. You know, having 1,000 users picking retention rules for any reason, and everybody interprets it differently, and they do it at their own whim and desire, that's not compliance. It's just not. Compliance is adherence to the official corporate retention schedule. End of story. You either are compliant with that or you're not. And we even measure it, which is you have to be compliant 85% of the time or higher in order to be compliant. And you have to measure that 85% and prove it. Otherwise, you're not compliant. Simple as that. So, in conclusion, these are the 5 reasons why retention policies are a bad idea. Number 1 is they are not records compliant. They are not locking the documents down or making them immutable, which is an essential seminal principle of record keeping. In other words, they will never be able to serve you as evidence in litigation. Number 2 is they compete with retention labels. If you allow that competition to happen, it'll be virtually impossible to keep track of it mentally in your head. What's the net retention on these records? The only safe way to deploy Purview is to disallow the competition. How do you do that? Don't use retention labels. Sorry, don't use retention policies. Just use labels. That's the only solution. Number 3 is retention policies cannot handle case records. You need event-driven dates for 60% or more of your records. For example, with the fleet vehicle maintenance, it's 5 years after end of life of vehicle. How do you record and where do you record the life of the vehicle? What about your union grievances? The retention rule is 5 years after end of union grievance. Where do the union grievances get stored? How do you trigger on those dates? You don't with retention policies. You just don't. What you do with labels. Number 4, if you are using retention policies and you move documents around, the retention can change. Retention is not supposed to change. Number 5, it's mentally difficult. I would propose it's impossible to track and manage all this competition and competing rules and people who can decide what they want to do. That's not manageable, and that was never going to deliver compliance. Okay? So that's it for this session. I'm completely done. I wanted to leave lots of time for question and answers. So feel free to dive right in. This is not a typical webinar. This is an educational session. So I invite you to unmute and ask any questions you might have. I'm assuming you have the ability to unmute. Pretty sure. Okay.
Good morning, Bruce.
Good morning.
I know you did a lot of discussion. Well, we had a lot of discussion around retention policy and so forth. To be able to review that, because sometimes we have folks to tell us, oh, we did this, we did this, we did this, but and we're fine. But if we needed to go and just kind of review what they have set for us, would that be inside of the admin console, or would that be exactly where could we view that?
You have to use a tool in Purview called the content. What's it called again? The content.
I think I heard of
There's the
that.
activity tracker, content tracker,
Explorer.
Explorer. Yes, thank you. I forgot what it was called. Yes, you had to use the Activity Explorer, and the Activity Explorer.
Activity Explorer.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, it's a crude instrument that does not give you a very accurate picture, and it's complex. So to paint, what you're really asking is, how do I paint a picture? What's really going on? What is my net effect?
Yes.
That picture is extremely difficult to paint. Very, very difficult. So my solution is don't get into it. Don't allow it. If you want to be truly compliant, just stay away from retention policies. Don't allow them to compete.
Okay.
Now, 2 quick questions that just came up in the chat. One is, can you get the slide deck? Yes, you'll be getting the slide deck tomorrow. Number 2 is, will we be addressing retention labels in another webinar? How did you guess? Absolutely, we will. An entire webinar focusing exclusively on labels. Are there any other questions?
So I have a comment, and I might be opening a can of worms, but we are using a retention policy for one thing only, which is to manage very clearly transitory content that we do not want remaining in our system. And that is Copilot chats. I am in a public agency subject to public disclosure rules. And we've determined that our Copilot activity is comparable to web browser activity, which is transitory in my state. But eDiscovery was retaining and had available tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands by now,
Yeah.
had implemented the policy
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
Copilot chat interactions that we just don't want. We can, they are still included in litigation holds, but for general user activity, we have a policy in place that is letting the system clear those out after 30 days. And that will really help us. Were we to get a public disclosure request for AI activity from agency employees, which I feel like a ticking clock is hanging over our heads there.
Yeah.
So just wanted to share, and that's very clearly using these policies as a cleanup function. We may in the future advise by policy, not Microsoft policy, but written agency policy, that Teams chats only be used for transitory communications, and use a policy to manage that content too, just to contain our
Right.
sprawl a little bit.
Right. So, Amy, that is a perfect example of a use case for a retention policy. Perfect. And you notice it's a cleanup. It's not applying
Yeah.
formal records, right? It's a cleanup. And that's exactly what I believe that these policies are useful for. It's important that you don't get seduced into thinking that a retention policy is going to get you records compliance, right? For the hard work of records compliance, you've got to step outside that limitation. You really do.
Yes. Yeah.
And
And
for
we're working on a big retention label project right now. So
and so you should.
the
Yeah.
webinar did pique my interest.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's lots to learn about labels, I can tell you that. Okay, so another question is suggestion, which is use policies for big bucket document cleanup and use a dedicated record software product such as Purview for records management. Absolutely. That's exactly my whole proposition here, which is policies have their place. They are not for records keeping. Now, here's a question which is extremely dangerous and, if not downright disturbing, but I'm going to go there, which is an innocent sounding question. Can the organization prevent a user from applying their own label? Well, now that is uncorking the the wormhole for sure. We're going there because that's an important question to ask. Really, really important. Here's the truth behind it. When you buy or deploy your SharePoint site tenant, there is no button on the SharePoint screen that allows a user to apply a label. That button is called Apply Label. It's in the lower right part of the SharePoint screen. And it also appears in OneDrive and in Exchange as well in the user interface. But guess what? It's not there. It doesn't exist. There is no way for a user to apply their own label. That's a good thing. However, the way Purview is built is that the first time you publish a label, let me repeat that. The first time you publish a label, Purview automatically wakes up that button and it appears on the screen on SharePoint, OneDrive, and Exchange. And you can never turn it off. In other words, once you let the cat out of the bag, it's too late. Okay? So look at your SharePoint. If it's not there, tell your whole IT team, don't ever publish a label. Don't ever do that. If you do, you basically ruined SharePoint. Because now users can do whatever they want. They don't like the retention label, they can override it with anything they want. And remember, what's a user going to see when they press that button? They're going to see about 20 to 30 characters wide in a selection list. How many unique retention rules will you have in your file plan? I don't know, 50 to 100, maybe some more. And they're going to be able to choose any one they want and apply it to any document they want for any reason they want at any time they want. And they can change their mind 20 times. Every day they can put a different retention rule on it if they want. That's not compliance. That's not. So that was a big question. Are there any other questions? Can you provide other good ways to use retention policies to clean up the site documents? Yes, there are lots of ways to apply retention policies for cleanup activities. You can apply it to project team. You can a whole team site. You can have them automatically applied if what certain conditions are met. There's a bunch of different ways you can do it. But remember, it's an extremely blunt instrument and it has no regard for any difference between documents. So if you have a library or a site or a folder that contains a mixture of documents that should be have event-driven retention versus none, it doesn't care, right? It goes ahead. And you know what? I just remembered there's a sixth reason here. Is that for real records keeping, when the end of the life is reached, normally it's a red light system. You want to have a review before you actually do the deletion. But with the retention policy, there is no review. It's deleted as soon as the time is up, it's gone, and that's it. That's another violation of records compliance, right? Are the retention labels the same thing as sensitivity labels? Another great question. Awesome questions, guys. Awesome. No, they're totally different. They're unrelated to each other. And we're getting a little bit into the label session now, but an item can only have one retention label at a time. If you read Purview documentation, it says one label at a time, but that's not true. It's one retention label at a time and one sensitivity label at a time. A sensitivity label bears no relationship whatsoever to retention rules. Okay. Now, the next question that I see there is how many labels are available in total? Okay, that's another $1 million question with a big wormhole that I love answering. Here we go. And this is in another webinar that I highly encourage you to attend called The Beating Heart of an EDRMS. This is the beating heart. There are two sets of rules inside SharePoint. You think there is one, but there's not. There's two. One is labels, which are retention rules. How many? You probably have 50 to 100 at most, no matter how big you are, because each label is nothing more than a permutation of the three elements of a retention rule. Trigger by age, 5 years and delete is one rule. Trigger by age, 10 years and delete is a second permutation. Trigger by end date, 15 years, then transfer to archives is a third permutation. There's not a lot of permutations. There's only about, I don't know, 50 to 100 typically. Okay, that's all you have. So are you ever going to run out of labels? No. Are you ever going to have a restriction on labels? Not on the quantity of labels. But what that question misses is the other species of rule, which is content rules. The labels do nothing for you. Nothing. You have to do something with them. And what do you do with them in Purview? You use a content rule, my language content rule, which says for this content in SharePoint, apply this retention rule. You will end up with, if you have 1,000 users, you'll end up with 2,000 to 3,000 of those rules. Trust me, 2,000 to 3,000 content rules. Now, what is a content rule called in Purview? It's called a auto-apply policy. That's the one and only safe way to use or apply labels. So you have to write these rules. You say, if library equals this and this metadata contains that, then pull this retention rule off the pile of 50 or so retention rules and apply it. Those content rules are highly, highly restricted. In fact, there's some inner workings, inner limitations of Purview that could limit you to as little as a couple of hundred, but you need several thousand of them. But that's another session. We can't get too deep into that, but there are a lot of restrictions on how you apply labels. No restrictions on the quantity of labels you can have, but many restrictions on how to apply them. Do we have a date for our Purview label presentation? Well, of course we do. Just go on our website, look at the schedule, and sign up for it. Any other questions? Feel free to speak up or put something in the chat. Okay, well, I guess I'll bring it to a close then. Again, thank you very much for attending, especially on a holiday. Oh, here's another question. If you have published labels, can you delete the labels to prevent the button from appearing? No. I had a long and acrimonious discussion with Microsoft about that. They told me that they can disable the button in the back end, which when I asked for clarification, they said that the button will still be there. The labels will still appear when they click the drop down on it, and it will look like it's applied, but it won't actually be applied. So they're faking the user out. That's doable, but that's, in my view, pretty ugly. I don't ever want to see that. Why should users be told that there's a feature there that doesn't work? Don't use it. I mean, that's just crazy, right? So no, you cannot remove the button, but you can disable the button. But users will be using it and it'll look and feel and act like they're being used. Okay, any other questions? No, that's very good. Well, once again, thank you especially for showing up on a holiday. I really appreciate that. And next time I schedule webinars, I'll be watching the holiday calendar. So once again, thank you all, and you'll all be getting an email from me likely tomorrow, certainly by Monday at the latest, with a link where you can download the recording. All
Thanks,
right,
Chris.
you're so welcome.